Welcome to Binging on Britain. I'm Katie and I'll be your hostess as we gorge on bits of British history. Each week we'll explore 10 questions about British history and archaeology. If you have a question you'd like answered, leave it in the comments and you may hear it in an upcoming episode. Let's dig in. Question number 1. How many wives did Henry VIII divorce? Anyone remotely familiar with the Tudor period will have heard the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, but it's a bit of a misnomer. Wife number 1 was Catherine of Aragon. Her marriage to Henry was longer than all of his other marriages combined, but he wasn't her first husband. In fact, she was married to his brother Arthur first. After Arthur's death, Catherine said that their marriage had never been consummated and eventually married Henry. After 24 years of obstetric nightmares, Catherine was menopausal, and they had a daughter Mary, but no legitimate son. His dynasty and legacy at stake, Henry found a bit of scripture that would be his excuse for putting her aside. He claimed their marriage hadn't been valid because of her marriage to his brother, and he broke with the Catholic Church in order to declare their marriage annulled. Now that Henry was no longer under the authority of the Pope, he proclaimed himself the supreme head of the newly founded Church of England and married Anne Boleyn. Henry had done the impossible to have her, but 3 years after they wed, they still had no son, just a daughter Elizabeth. Anne was brought up on fabricated charges of adultery, incest, witchcraft, and treason. Their marriage was annulled, Anne was found guilty and swiftly beheaded. Just curious, with their marriage invalidated, how could Anne have committed adultery? Logic seems not to have been Henry's strong suit, but I digress. Poor Jane Seymour. She wed Henry with Anne barely cold in her grave, but Jane succeeded where Catherine and Anne had failed. Jane gave birth to Henry's son. In her moment of greatest triumph, Jane succumbed to puerperal fever, basically a severe infection after childbirth which led to sepsis and death. While mourning Jane, Henry decided on a dynastic marriage. He chose Cleves, and Anne number 2 became wife number 4. Henry was not attracted to Anne and found himself unable to consummate the union, to put it delicately. Anne was paid off and an annulment declared. Anne lived well and was welcome in court with the title the King's Sister. Anne outlived Henry and all of his queens, living well into the reign of Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary I. Henry then brought Catherine Howard down the aisle. The poor girl was quite young and had a troublesome history. In today's society, she would have been thought of as the victim of child sexual assault, but in her time, she was viewed as unchaste. Her impurity went a bit further, as she seems to have had an affair with Thomas Culpeper while her husband the king was on progress. This behavior was not only unacceptable for a good Christian queen, it also hit Henry right where it hurt. His ego. A bill of attainder was passed, making it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king. Catherine was charged with adultery and treason and executed. Finally, we have Catherine 3.0. Catherine Parr deftly handled her third husband and managed to stay by his side until his death 4 years later. So the reality is that Henry never divorced, and while it doesn't roll right off the tongue, his marital history is more accurately annulled, died, annulled, beheaded, survived. Question number 2. How long ago was Stonehenge built? Stonehenge was built in stages, but it was begun roughly 5,000 years ago and took about 1,500 years to complete. Talk about long-term construction. Question number 3. Was Henry VII the usurper? This is just my opinion, but no. Henry won the crown through conquest, much like another monarch who would have otherwise been barred from the throne, William the Conqueror. Both Henry and William won the English crown when they fought and killed the reigning kings, Richard III and King Harold respectively. TudorHistory.org states, the real matter was decided on the battlefield, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. It was here that Henry and his forces met with Richard III, and Henry won the crown. It was truly through the defeat of Richard and the right of conquest that Henry claimed the throne. It was solidified, however, by his marriage to Elizabeth of York, the eldest child of the late King Edward IV. Question number 4. How did King Harold II die? An arrow to the eye. Ouch! In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror, note I did not say William the Usurper, defeated the Anglo-Saxon army, and King Harold II was killed. William won the crown by right of conquest, earning him the epithet Conqueror, which replaced Bastard, as William had been previously known. Harold was buried without any pomp, perhaps even secretively, and the location of his remains are unknown to us today. Question number 5. What are the badges of the houses of Lancaster, York, and Tudor? Lancaster was a red rose, York a white rose, and Tudor a white rose superimposed on a red rose to signify the joining of the houses of Lancaster and York due to the marriage of Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York. Question number 6. How many queens regnant has England had? 6. Mary I, Elizabeth I, Mary II, Anne, Victoria, and Elizabeth II. And some may count Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, bringing the official count to 7. Question number 7. Who burned Colchester? Boudica, the Celtic queen of the Iceni, razed the city, then known as Camulodunum, to the ground after the Romans whipped Boudica, raped her daughters, and refused to honor her husband's agreement with them that his kingdom would be split between his daughters and the emperor upon his death. Question number 8. What did Romans in Britain do with unwanted babies? This is a really sad subject, and it may be triggering for some listeners, and if you think you may be in that category, I'll give you a moment to skip ahead to the next question. So, it may be really hard for some of us to imagine, but in Roman culture, infants had no rights and weren't even thought of as fully people. They were considered their father's property, and he had the right to decide to raise the child or not. Babies who were deformed, of the wrong gender, made one too many mouths to feed, or maybe looked a little too much like the milkman, would be left out in the open to either be adopted by someone who came along and cared for them or die of exposure, possibly even becoming the victims of wild animals. In 1912, at Uden Villa in Buckinghamshire, a Roman cemetery was found which contained the remains of 97 infants, who all died at 38 to 40 weeks gestation. There was no sign of injury or illness, and there seemed to be no real understanding of what had brought this vast amount of seemingly healthy infants to their graves all at the time of birth. The theory has been floated, and personally I believe it's accurate, that this was the site of a brothel, and that the infants were killed when they were born, either by the mothers or someone who exercised power over the mothers. This theory is currently being studied, and I'll be sure to let you know what the conclusion the scientists come to. Question number 9. Who did Alfred the Great defeat? Alfred defeated the Vikings of the Great Heathen Army. He had the Viking king Guthrum converted to Christianity as part of a treaty, and he gave the Vikings land in exchange for their promise not to attack his kingdom. And it worked until it didn't. Question number 10. Where is Catherine of Aragon interred? Henry VIII's first queen and the mother of England's first queen regnant is buried at Peterborough Cathedral. If you decide to visit, bring a pomegranate to lay on her grave. You may notice that others have done this as well. Pomegranates were Catherine's heraldic badge, and as such, they are left to honor this ruthlessly discarded queen. Thanks for joining me as we binge on British history. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment. If you'd like a shout out in a future episode, please take a moment to leave a question about British history that you'd like answered. For more information about today's questions, see the links in the description, and please join me next week as we tackle 10 new questions on binging on Britain. Have a great day. Bye-bye.